You know who the Vikings were. You watched the movies. You saw the horned helmets, the savage warriors burning villages, the bloodthirsty raiders screaming across the freezing sea. You know they were brutal. You know they were barbaric. You know they were the Dark Age's most feared killers. The problem? Almost everything you know was made up. And the 15 facts I'm about to show you are going to tear down every single layer of that myth. Subscribe to our channel and give our videos some hype to help us out. Here's something that'll make you question everything. The single most recognizable image of the Vikings, that horned helmet, was never worn by a single Viking warrior in the history of the Norse world. Not one. Archaeologists have excavated thousands of Viking graves across Norway, Sweden, Denmark, and Iceland. In all of those digs, exactly one complete Viking helmet has ever been found. It was discovered in Germanbu, Norway in 1943. It had no horns, just a simple iron dome with a nose guard. So where did the horned helmet come from? A costume designer named Karl Emil Doppler invented it in 1876 for a German opera called Ring of the Nibelung. One theater production. That's it. That single costume decision infected paintings, novels, and eventually Hollywood films for the next 150 years. The most iconic Viking image in history was designed for a stage show, and the world never questioned it. The real Vikings would have laughed, or more likely, they would have been furious. Think about this. The people history remembers as unwashed savage barbarians were actually among the cleanest humans in medieval Europe. In 922 AD, Arab diplomat Ibn Fadlan traveled deep into Viking territory along the Volga River and documented everything he saw. He wrote extensively about Viking hygiene, combing their hair daily, washing their hands and faces every morning, and bathing at least once a week. Once a week was extraordinary for that era. Archaeological digs across Scandinavia have confirmed every word. Viking graves consistently contain combs made from antler bone, tweezers, ear cleaners, and razors. These weren't luxury items for the wealthy. They were found in ordinary graves belonging to everyday people. Medieval English monks, who had every reason to hate Vikings, actually recorded complaints that Norsemen were stealing their women because they bathed too frequently and dressed too well. The barbarians that Hollywood showed you bathing in mud were, in reality, making medieval Europeans look filthy by comparison. That detail didn't make it into any movie. Here's something that'll surprise you. On October 12, 1492, Christopher Columbus landed in the Caribbean and the world celebrated the discovery of America. There was just one problem. Vikings had already been there and left 500 years earlier. Around 1000 AD, Norse explorer Leif Erikson sailed west from Greenland and landed in a place he called Vinland. For decades, historians dismissed this as legend. Then in 1960, archaeologists discovered Lance aux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, an actual Viking settlement with Norse buildings, iron tools, and artifacts dating precisely to around 1000 AD. This wasn't a brief landing. Vikings built structures, wintered there, and conducted operations for years. The sagas describe conflicts with local indigenous people they called Skrælings. Columbus arrived to a continent where Norse explorers had already walked, built, and sailed home from. The difference is Columbus's voyage triggered permanent colonization, Leif's did not. But the discovery? That belongs to a Norse sailor who set foot on American soil when Europe still thought the world ended at the ocean's edge. Picture this. The year is 900 AD. Across Europe, women are property. They cannot own land, cannot divorce their husbands, cannot speak in legal proceedings, and cannot carry weapons. Then you cross into Viking territory, and everything changes. Norse women could legally own property in their own name. They could demand a divorce and keep their dowry. They could run farms and businesses independently while their husbands were away raiding. They could carry weapons and were legally protected from harassment in public spaces. Arab traveler Al-Tartushi visited Viking settlements in the 10th century and documented his shock in writing. He described women who spoke openly, made decisions publicly, and divorced men who displeased them as casually as changing clothes. This wasn't theoretical freedom written in a law book nobody followed. Archaeological evidence backs it up. Female Viking graves have been found containing weapons, trade weights, and keys, the keys symbolizing control over the household economy. The most famous recent discovery, a high-status Viking warrior grave found in Birka, Sweden, was assumed for 150 years to be male. DNA testing in 2017 confirmed it was a woman. She was buried with a full set of weapons and 2 horses. Here's the part nobody teaches in school. The word Viking itself comes from the Old Norse word vik, meaning a small bay or creek, referring to the sheltered harbors where Norse merchants anchored their trading ships. Most people who lived in Scandinavia during the Viking Age never raided anything. They were farmers, craftsmen, and traders. The raiders were a minority, and even they raided part-time between trading seasons. Viking trade routes in the 9th and 10th centuries were staggering in their reach. Norse traders traveled from their Scandinavian homelands west to Canada, south to Spain and North Africa, and east all the way to Baghdad and Constantinople. Arab silver coins called dirhams have been found by the thousands in Viking hordes across Scandinavia, evidence of active trade with the Islamic world. In the markets of Constantinople, Norse traders sold furs, amber, and walrus ivory in exchange for silk, spices, and silver. The same men Hollywood shows burning monasteries were sitting in Baghdad bazaars negotiating prices with Arab merchants. That version of the Viking story has never once appeared on a movie screen. Think about this. Every time someone says going berserk in English, they are unknowingly referencing a specific class of Viking warrior that terrified the medieval world. Berserkers were real. Ancient Norse sagas describe them fighting in a trance-like state, immune to pain, impossibly strong, completely oblivious to wounds that would stop any normal man. Contemporary accounts from enemies described watching berserkers take multiple sword strikes and keep fighting without flinching. Modern researchers have studied this seriously. The leading theory involves consumption of Amanita muscaria, a psychoactive mushroom that grows across Scandinavia, combined with years of specific psychological conditioning that train warriors to dissociate from pain during combat. The physical symptoms described in sagas match known effects of that mushroom precisely. Other researchers point to extreme hyperventilation rituals performed before battle that alter brain chemistry. Whatever the mechanism, berserkers were not a Hollywood invention. They were a documented military phenomenon that opposing armies genuinely feared and strategically tried to avoid. The word they gave to the world is still used daily, 1,000 years later. Here's something that'll leave your jaw on the floor. In 930 AD, while most of Europe was operating under feudal systems where a lord's word was law and peasants had zero legal rights, Vikings in Iceland created the Althing. It was one of the world's first democratic parliaments. Every free man had the right to attend. Laws were not written down. They were memorized by an elected official called the law speaker, whose entire job was to recite 1/3 of the legal code publicly every year so everyone knew their rights. The Althing handled everything: property disputes, murder cases, divorces, trade disagreements. There were formal procedures, the right to present evidence, and the concept of outlawry, the most severe punishment, which meant being declared outside the protection of the law, essentially making someone stateless. England's Magna Carta, celebrated as the foundation of modern democracy, came in 1215 AD. The Viking Althing predated it by nearly 300 years. The people history taught you as lawless barbarians built a functioning legal democracy while the rest of Europe was still figuring out feudalism. Here's a number that puts everything in perspective. 3 feet. That is the draft, the depth of water needed for a Viking longship to sail. 3 feet of water. The same vessel that could navigate shallow rivers and beach directly on open shores could also cross the entire Atlantic Ocean in open water. No other ship design in human history has ever achieved both of those things simultaneously. Modern naval architects who have studied Viking longships describe the design as solving problems that shipbuilders wouldn't theoretically solve again for another 5 centuries. The secret was the hull construction technique called clinker building, overlapping wooden planks that created a flexible hull absorbing wave impact rather than fighting it. Viking longships literally bent slightly in heavy seas instead of cracking under pressure. They were also extraordinarily light. Some could be carried overland by their crews when rivers became impassable. In 1893, a full replica longship called the Viking sailed from Bergen, Norway to Chicago, Illinois in 28 days. No modifications. No modern materials. Just the original 9th century design crossing the Atlantic without a single structural problem. The engineers who built the Titanic could have learned something. Here's the detail history books don't talk about. Viking society ran on slavery. The Norse word for slave was thrall, a word that entered the English language meaning someone trapped and powerless. Historians estimate that between 10 and 30% of the population in Viking Scandinavia were enslaved people, captured primarily from Ireland, England, Scotland, and Eastern Europe during raids. The monastery raids that made Vikings infamous were often slave-gathering operations as much as treasure hunts. But here's the disturbing twist. Viking law was deeply contradictory on slavery. The same legal system that gave free women divorce rights and guaranteed men fair trials classified other human beings as property. As Viking trade networks expanded, thralls became a major commodity, sold in markets from Dublin to Constantinople. The moral contradiction between Viking concepts of personal honor and freedom on one hand and mass human trafficking on the other created internal social tensions that historians now believe contributed significantly to the fragmentation of Norse society. A civilization that built one of the ancient world's first democracies simultaneously ran one of its largest slave trading operations. That paradox never appears in the movies. Everybody knows the story. The Vikings faded out because Christianity spread, because European kingdoms got stronger, because the raids stopped paying off. Here's what nobody told you. The final blow to Viking civilization wasn't military or religious. It was weather. Starting around 1300 AD, a period now called the Little Ice Age began cooling temperatures across the North Atlantic. Growing seasons in Greenland, where Vikings had maintained thriving farming settlements for 300 years, collapsed completely. The Norse Greenland settlements had supported thousands of people at their peak. Archaeological evidence shows a community that held on desperately, eating their livestock, then their dogs, then whatever washed up on the shore. One site excavated in the 20th century revealed a farmhouse where the last occupant died alone, their body found curled on the floor with no signs of violence and no food remaining anywhere in the building. The entire settlement had simply ended. No evacuation, no recorded departure, just silence. The Vikings didn't lose to armies or Christianity. They lost to a temperature drop of 2 degrees Celsius that their agricultural system couldn't survive. Picture this. You are a monastery on the Irish coast in 850 AD. You have heard the stories about Vikings. The stories are specific, detailed, and horrifying, and they were designed to be. Before any longship appeared on the horizon, the Viking reputation had already done half the work. Norse warriors understood something that modern military strategists call force multiplication through reputation. The idea that making an enemy believe resistance is hopeless causes surrender without combat. Vikings cultivated their terrifying image deliberately. Specific acts of brutality were performed publicly and allowed to circulate through the medieval information network. Traveling merchants, ransomed hostages, surviving witnesses. Archaeological and written evidence shows that some of the most extreme acts attributed to Vikings were performed specifically in visible, memorable ways rather than efficient ones. The famous blood eagle ritual described in Norse sagas, whether it literally happened or was itself a piece of psychological storytelling, spread terror across Europe for generations. An enemy that surrenders without fighting costs you nothing. The Vikings understood that calculation 1,200 years before modern psychological operations manuals were written. Here's the part that rewrites the timeline completely. In 782 AD, the Frankish Emperor Charlemagne ordered the massacre of 4,500 pagan Saxon prisoners in a single day at a place called Verdun. His entire military campaign against the Saxons included forced conversion to Christianity under penalty of death. The first major Viking raid on a European monastery, the famous attack on Lindisfarne in 793 AD, happened 11 years later. When you map the intensification of Viking raids against the expansion of Christian kingdoms into Norse trading territories and pagan communities, the correlation is striking. Norse traders had existing relationships with pagan Saxon communities that Christian conquest was destroying. Norse religious sites were being threatened by expanding Christian missionaries. The monasteries that Vikings raided were not random targets. They were the administrative and financial centers of the kingdoms that were systematically eliminating Norse allies and trading partners. This doesn't justify the raids, but it completely destroys the Hollywood narrative of unprovoked savage barbarians attacking innocent Christians for pure bloodlust. It was a geopolitical conflict, and the Christians started it. Here's something that will completely change how you see Viking society. Around 900 AD, a Viking warrior takes a deep abdominal wound in battle. His companions feed him a strong-smelling soup made from onions and herbs and make him eat it. Then they lean close and smell the wound. If they can detect onion smell coming from the injury site, they know the intestines have been punctured, and they prepare for the worst. If they smell nothing, they treat the wound aggressively and expect survival. This was a real diagnostic technique documented in Viking medical sagas, and it is physiologically sound. Modern surgeons confirm that gastric content leaking from a punctured intestine would indeed be detectable through a wound. Viking medical texts also describe herbal treatments for infection, procedures for setting broken bones, and evidence of amputations where the patient survived long enough for the bone to show healing in archaeological specimens. Medieval European medicine at the same time was largely based on prayer and bloodletting. The people you were taught to see as reckless destroyers were performing survivable field surgery, while European physicians were recommending leeches. Think about this every single week. Thursday. The word you use every 7 days without thinking about it is a direct linguistic artifact of Viking religious domination of Northern Europe. Thursday comes from Thor's Day, named after the Norse god of thunder. Wednesday is Woden's Day, Odin, the chief Norse god. Friday is Frigg's Day, named after the Norse goddess of marriage and foresight. Tuesday is Tyr's Day, named after the Norse god of war and justice. 4 out of 7 days of the English week carry the names of Norse gods. This isn't a coincidence or a minor historical footnote. It reflects how completely Viking culture penetrated and shaped the societies they interacted with. The English language itself carries permanent marks of Norse influence. Words like sky, window, knife, husband, egg, and hundreds of others are direct borrowings from Old Norse. A civilization that Hollywood reduced to burning and pillaging left such a deep permanent mark on the English language that native speakers invoke Norse gods by name every single week without realizing it. That is not the legacy of savages. That is the legacy of a culture that rewired a civilization. Here's the most disturbing fact of all. Almost everything you were taught about Vikings came from one source: Christian monks. In medieval Europe, monks were the only people who wrote things down. They ran the scriptoriums, maintained the libraries, and produced virtually all surviving written records from the Viking Age. And the monks had a very specific problem with the Vikings. Norse raiders kept attacking their monasteries and stealing their stuff. So the monks wrote about Vikings the way you would expect people to write about enemies who robbed them. They emphasized the violence, the brutality, the paganism. They omitted the trade networks, the legal systems, the art, the exploration, and the engineering. The losers of the monastery raids wrote the history, and the world accepted that history uncritically for over 1,000 years. Hollywood then took those monk-authored accounts and turned them into entertainment. The real Vikings built the city of Dublin, established trade routes to Baghdad, created one of the world's first parliaments, and permanently shaped the English language. That version of the story never sold movie tickets. So the horned helmet version did instead. The Vikings weren't the savages Hollywood sold you. They were explorers who reached America 500 years before Columbus. Lawmakers who built democracy before England. Engineers whose ship designs baffled modern naval architects. Traders who sat in Baghdad markets while European merchants barely left their own villages. The savage image was written by the people they raided and repeated by everyone who came after. Comment below, which fact destroyed everything you thought you knew? And if history books told the real Viking story, would you read them?